Hello, and welcome to Absolute Value Equations. We're going to take a pretty straightforward intermediate algebra look at these equations today. So first of all, what is an absolute value? The absolute value of a real number, n, so real numbers, we're not looking at complex numbers here, we're looking at real numbers. Absolute value, so these two little lines are the absolute value symbol. It's the distance from 0 to n on a real number line. Let's just erase that. I don't know why that happened. So it's a distance, and that's why a distance we always think is positive, but really to get from where I am now to where I am now, I could go a distance of 0. So we really think of the absolute value as being non-negative in general. Now an absolute value, if n is a positive real number and u is any algebraic expression, wow, I can't even read to myself today, then the absolute value of u is equal to n, means either u is n or u is negative n. If n is negative, then the equation has no real solutions, and if n is 0, then u must be 0. Okay, so if it's positive, we have two options. If n is negative, it's never going to happen because distance will never be negative, non-negative. And if it's 0, then the whole expression must be 0. It's the only way we could get 0. Okay, so to solve an absolute value equation, what we're going to do is first we're going to isolate the absolute value part. Then we're going to rewrite as two equations, if we can. Actually, we look at whether it's the number on the right hand side is positive, negative, or 0. Then we'll solve. And you should always check. That's one of the best things about math, is you could check your answer and see if it works. Okay, so let's solve the following equations. That's it. That's the whole lecture. The rest of this is all examples. So first of all, I have the absolute value by itself, not myself, but I have isolated the absolute value. Fantastic. So let's just write that here. Isolate. Done. So next step is rewrite. When we rewrite, we take our expression, x minus 2 equals 7, or x minus 2 equals negative 7. And actually, let's do this correctly. It should be and. In math, the and or are very important to keep straight. So and or, very important. With a square root property, we would use or. With the absolute values, we're going to use and. Now we can solve each equation. Fantastic. Let's solve this. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. Yeah, that was really weird how I did that. And we end up with x equals 9 and x equals negative 5. So I'm going to put those over here. And we can check. To check this, I'm going to say 9 minus 2 inside absolute values. 9 minus 2 is 7. The absolute value is 7. Fantastic. But what if I have a negative 5 minus 2 in absolute values? The absolute values do not change negatives to positives. What the absolute value does is it deals with the end result. So once I have a negative 7 and that's the only thing in absolute values, now the absolute value makes it non-negative. So we know that these are both a good answer. There we go. There's our two answers. Let's try it again. Let me just slap the mic around a little bit, see if that increases the quality of our recording here. All right, so I want to isolate. To isolate the absolute value part, I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Absolute value of d minus 2 equals negative 6. Because this is negative, we know there is no solution. So it's not because that 15 was negative to start with. It's only after we isolate the absolute value that we will determine if we write two equations, if there's no solution, or if it turns out that we'll have something with one solution with a 0. Okay, so we want to isolate the absolute value of w plus 1 in problem 3. So we're going to slowly peel away from the absolute value. Negative 3, absolute value of w plus 1 equals negative 15, but keep in mind the absolute value is not isolated yet because I still have this negative 3 as a factor out in front. Now the w plus 1 in absolute values is isolated and will equal 5. Once we have isolated the absolute value, now we have two equations. W plus 1 equals 5, and w plus 1 equals negative 5. And the way I remember it is there's two lines. For absolute value, I should look for two answers. It's the little things. It's the little things that always help us remember what we need to do. Let's subtract 1 from both sides. Subtract 1 from both sides. I find that w equals 4 and w equals negative 6. We could check this on the calculator rather than by hand as we did up here by typing in negative 3 and then absolute value. I'm going to go to math, and I believe it's over at number. Yes, ABS, absolute value of 4 plus 1. Come out of the absolute value, plus 12. Hopefully this equals negative 3. Let's see. Fantastic. And we could do second function entry. So second enter will bring up what we just typed in. Now instead of that 4, I'm going to put in a negative, and then I'm going to insert the 6 so I don't have to retype the whole thing. And we know that they're both correct answers. Being able to check your answers is one of the best parts about math, so don't be shy. Always check them out. All right, so how might we use this in a problem? And driving is probably one of the biggest, most frequent examples we have. Svetlana is driving from San Antonio to Houston, Texas on Interstate 10 and will pass through Columbus, Texas on the way. Svetlana's distance from Columbus can be modeled by the function d of t equals the absolute value of the quantity 125 minus 65t, where d of t is Svetlana's distance in miles from Columbus, Texas after driving for t hours. Find the time when Svetlana will be 25 miles away from Columbus. And I don't know about you, but I find it kind of easy to get lost in these types of problems. So here's what I do. After I read through the whole thing, I'm like, okay, she's driving, I have this formula, I gotta find some stuff. So I wanna find the time when. This tells me to solve for t. That looks like solve fort. So let's maybe move this t over here a little bit. Solve for time when, and here I see that my distance is 25. Now, we don't know which side of Columbus she is. Is she on the San Antonio side or the Houston side? It doesn't matter because the absolute value is going to take care of which side are we on. So what we'll do is we'll replace d of t with 25 and solve this equation for t. Well, in solving this equation, we find that the absolute value is already isolated. It's equal to a positive value. So we'll have two equations. 25 equals 125 minus 65t and negative 25. Maybe she's 25 miles before Columbus. Equals 125 minus 65t. So I subtract 125 from both sides. Let's just finish this side first. I'll have a negative 100 equals negative 65t. So to get t by itself, let's divide both sides by a negative 65. And we have negative 100 divided by a negative 65. Maybe I'll make it a 5 instead of a 2. Delete for a single character, clear if you want to wipe out a whole line. And I get a really, really difficult number to understand. So 1.538, we'll call it there. All right. Now let's solve the other one. If I subtract 125 from both sides, I end up with a negative 150 equals a negative 65t. If we divide both sides by a negative 65, I end up with a negative divided by negative is positive, so I'm just going to focus on the number portion of it. I already know my result will be positive time, and this is 2.307. We're going to round that 7 up to an 8. Find the time when Svetlana will be 25 miles away from Columbus. Now think about this. Here's what we have going on. We have San Antonio and we have Houston. Pardon my geography. I happen to know Houston is east of San Antonio, but I don't remember if it's due east. Oh, they're probably closer to the same latitude. Doesn't matter. Somewhere here we have Columbus. So she's leaving San Antonio by the time she gets to Houston, so this is time 0. Columbus, she could either be 1.5 hours into her journey or 2.3 hours into her journey, and she is exactly 25 miles from Columbus. So the answer makes sense. It seems reasonable, both sides of Columbus having left San Antonio to get to Houston. Answers are reasonable, so I would probably look back at the problem and wonder why it didn't tell me how to round. But I definitely don't really want this in a fraction, because the fraction won't be helpful. You're going to tell somebody they're going to travel for 30/13ths of an hour, they're going to look at you like you're no longer in control. So that's it. Absolute value equations. Thanks for listening.